By mid-1944, the United States had seized the strategic initiative across the Pacific. Amphibious operations conducted over the previous 2 years had dismantled Japan's outer defensive perimeter and brought American forces within operational reach of the Philippines. The trajectory of the war appeared increasingly favorable. Industrial capacity, naval power, and air superiority allowed U.S. planners to choose where and when to apply force. Within this context of expanding options, the decision to seize the small coral island of Peleliu emerged as part of a broader operational design rather than as an isolated tactical necessity. Peleliu was identified as a potential threat to upcoming operations in the Western Pacific. Its airfield, located near projected invasion routes toward the Philippines, was assessed as a risk to Allied naval and amphibious movements. Neutralizing this threat aligned with prevailing U.S. doctrine, which emphasized securing forward airfields to protect advancing forces. The operation was approved within an institutional framework that prioritized systematic reduction of enemy positions along anticipated lines of advance. However, the strategic environment evolved rapidly. Intelligence assessments regarding Japanese air capability in the region changed, and the pace of operations elsewhere outstripped earlier planning assumptions. Despite these developments, the decision to proceed with the assault on Peleliu remained unchanged. The operation moved forward largely as conceived, reflecting institutional momentum and adherence to established planning logic. What followed was one of the most costly engagements fought by U.S. forces in the Pacific relative to its strategic return. The Battle of Peleliu did not fail in execution. It succeeded in achieving its stated objectives. The airfield was captured, and Japanese resistance was eventually neutralized. Yet the cost incurred raised fundamental questions about necessity, adaptability, and the relationship between strategic intent and operational outcome. The Battle of Peleliu matters, not because it altered the course of the war, but because it illustrates how decisions made under one set of assumptions can persist, even as conditions change. It provides a case study in how doctrine, intelligence interpretation, and institutional inertia can converge to produce outcomes that are operationally successful but strategically inefficient. The decision to assault Peleliu originated within a strategic framework shaped by U.S. operational doctrine in the Central Pacific, rather than by conditions specific to the island itself. By early 1944, American forces had established a pattern of advance, characterized by sequential amphibious operations, each designed to secure airfields and anchor points that would support the next phase of movement westward. This approach emphasized control of terrain and infrastructure as prerequisites for freedom of action, reflecting lessons drawn from earlier campaigns in the Solomons and the Gilberts. Within this framework, Peleliu entered planning discussions as part of a broader operational concept, later designated Operation Stalemate 2. The Palau Islands were identified as a potential threat axis to future operations aimed at the Philippines. The logic was straightforward. Japanese airfields in the Western Carolines could interfere with Allied amphibious landings and naval movements if left intact. Neutralization of these facilities was therefore viewed as a prudent preparatory step. Peleliu's airfield, though modest in scale, became the focal point of this assessment. Intelligence estimates suggested that the island could host aircraft capable of striking Allied shipping during forthcoming operations. U.S. planners, operating within a doctrine that emphasized eliminating threats rather than accepting calculated risk, concluded that seizure of the island would reduce uncertainty. This conclusion aligned with an institutional preference for comprehensive control over incremental or selective engagement. However, this assessment was rooted in assumptions that were already beginning to erode. By mid-1944, Japanese naval aviation had suffered severe attrition, and the ability of isolated island airfields to project sustained air power was diminishing rapidly. Carrier-based air superiority and improved anti-aircraft defenses further reduced the practical threat posed by such installations. Despite these changes, the planning process for Peleliu continued largely unchanged, reflecting the inertia inherent in large-scale operational design. The operational plan called for a direct amphibious assault supported by naval gunfire and air bombardment, followed by rapid seizure of the airfield and elimination of remaining resistance. The mission was assigned to the U.S. 1st Marine Division, an experienced formation that had previously conducted successful landings under fire. Command expectations reflected confidence that the operation would be brief. Official estimates suggested that organized resistance could be overcome within a matter of days. This expectation was reinforced by earlier experiences in which Japanese defenses relied heavily on beach-line opposition and bonsai-style counterattacks. U.S. doctrine and training were optimized to defeat such tactics through overwhelming firepower and rapid inland advance. Peleliu was initially evaluated through this same analytical lens. The possibility that Japanese forces might adopt a fundamentally different defensive approach was not fully integrated into operational planning. Japanese defensive preparations on Peleliu, however, represented a doctrinal evolution. Rather than contesting the landing beaches directly, Japanese commanders emphasized defense in depth, utilizing the island's rugged coral ridges and cave systems to absorb bombardment and inflict attrition over time. This approach sought not to defeat the landing force outright, but to maximize cost and delay, exploiting the attacker's need to secure limited terrain under hostile conditions. U.S. intelligence detected elements of this defensive posture, but did not fully appreciate its implications. Estimates of Japanese strength on the island varied, and the complexity of the terrain was acknowledged, but not operationally internalized. Pre-invasion bombardment plans assumed that sustained naval and aerial fire would neutralize most defensive positions, reducing resistance to manageable levels once ground forces landed. The institutional context in which these decisions were made is critical. By 1944, the U.S. military machine was operating at scale, with multiple simultaneous campaigns competing for attention and resources. Planning cycles were compressed, and operations were often approved months in advance. Once an operation entered execution phase, altering or cancelling it required strong justification and carried perceived risk to broader campaign coherence. Peleliu thus became embedded within a sequence of planned actions whose logic depended more on continuity than reassessment. Even as intelligence regarding Japanese air capability and defensive doctrine evolved, the operation retained its original rationale. The airfield remained classified as a threat, and its neutralization remained a stated objective despite diminishing evidence that it posed decisive risk. This dynamic illustrates a recurring feature of large-scale warfare. Decisions made under one set of conditions can persist beyond their period of relevance. In the case of Peleliu, strategic necessity was defined early and reaffirmed through repetition, rather than re-evaluation. The operation was not driven by urgency on the ground, but by adherence to an established planning model. By the time assault forces embarked, the gap between perceived necessity and actual strategic value had widened. Yet within the institutional framework of the Pacific War, this gap was difficult to acknowledge. The operation promised certainty, control of an airfield, elimination of a potential threat, even if the threat itself was increasingly theoretical. Understanding this precondition is essential to analyzing what followed. The Battle of Peleliu did not originate from reckless ambition or tactical miscalculation. It emerged from a rational system operating on outdated assumptions, prioritizing doctrinal consistency over adaptive reassessment. The cost of this rigidity would only become apparent once U.S. forces confronted the operational reality of the island itself. Part 1 therefore establishes the central analytical tension of the battle. Strategic necessity was asserted through institutional logic, rather than continuously validated against changing conditions. The operation moved forward, not because Peleliu was indispensable, but because the planning system had little incentive to stop. The consequences of this decision would define the character and cost of the battle that followed. The opening phase of the Battle of Peleliu exposed a fundamental disconnect between American operational expectations and Japanese defensive reality. When U.S. forces landed on 15th of September 1944, the assault unfolded largely as planned at the tactical level. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardment had suppressed visible defenses, and the beach landings encountered less immediate resistance than anticipated. This apparent success reinforced pre-existing assumptions that Japanese resistance had been neutralized and that rapid inland advance would follow. These assumptions proved incorrect within hours. Japanese defensive doctrine on Peleliu had undergone a deliberate transformation. Rather than contesting the beaches, Japanese forces adopted a system of defense in depth, centered on terrain exploitation, concealment, and attrition. This approach was overseen by Kunio Nakagawa, whose defensive plan rejected decisive engagement in favor of prolonged resistance. The objective was not to repel the landing, but to impose maximum cost over time by denying the attacker a clear operational resolution. The island's geography enabled this doctrine. Peleliu's central ridges, particularly the Umer-Brogel complex, consisted of jagged coral formations riddled with caves, tunnels, and mutually supporting firing positions. These features provided natural protection against bombardment and allowed Japanese units to survive preparatory fires largely intact. Defensive positions were camouflaged, interconnected, and oriented to engage advancing forces from multiple angles. American pre-invasion fire plans assumed that sustained naval and aerial bombardment would destroy most fixed defenses. This assumption was grounded in earlier experience, where Japanese positions had been more exposed and less integrated. At Peleliu, bombardment neutralized surface targets but failed to collapse subterranean networks. As U.S. forces advanced inland, they encountered resistance that appeared suddenly, unpredictably, and at close range. The initial American advance toward the airfield reflected doctrinal confidence. Infantry units moved rapidly, supported by armor and artillery, expecting diminishing resistance once inland. Instead, they encountered well-coordinated defensive fires that halted movement and inflicted casualties disproportionate to progress gained. Japanese units remained largely invisible until they engaged, then withdrew into fortified positions immune to immediate retaliation. This pattern disrupted American operational rhythm. Standard responses, artillery preparation followed by infantry advance, proved less effective against concealed defenders who controlled engagement timing. The absence of a clear front line further complicated command and control. Units faced resistance from multiple directions simultaneously, eroding situational awareness and slowing coordination. The airfield itself was secured relatively early, reinforcing the perception that the operation was succeeding. However, its capture did not translate into operational advantage. Japanese resistance shifted focus toward the ridges dominating the island, where the decisive fighting would occur. Control of the airfield did not equate to control of the battle space, revealing a mismatch between stated objectives and operational reality. Casualties mounted rapidly as U.S. forces attempted to reduce fortified positions through frontal assault. Heat, terrain, and limited water compounded the physical strain. The pace of operations slowed as units became pinned down by fire from positions that were difficult to locate and harder to destroy. Armor support was constrained by terrain, and close coordination between infantry and supporting fires became increasingly complex. Commanders on the ground recognized that the battle was diverging sharply from expectations. What had been anticipated as a short operation began to resemble a protracted engagement, requiring systematic reduction of defensive networks. This realization did not immediately alter operational approach, as doctrine and planning cycles lagged behind unfolding conditions. The Japanese defensive system achieved its intended effect. By avoiding decisive confrontation and relying on attrition, it forced U.S. forces into a costly process of clearance. Each position required individual attention, consuming time and resources. The absence of large-scale counterattacks denied American forces opportunities for decisive engagement, prolonging the battle without offering a clear enemy target. From an analytical perspective, this phase demonstrates how doctrinal surprise can occur even when intelligence indicators exist. The concept of defense in depth was not unknown, but its full implications were underestimated. American doctrine emphasized overcoming resistance through firepower and momentum. Peleliu required patience, adaptation, and acceptance of slow progress. By the end of this phase, it was evident that the Battle of Peleliu would not conform to initial estimates. Tactical success in landing and seizing key objectives masked a deeper operational challenge. The island had not been neutralized. It had absorbed the assault and imposed a new form of battle on the attacker. Part 2 thus marks the point at which operational cost began to diverge sharply from strategic expectation. The landing succeeded, but the underlying rationale for the operation, rapid neutralization of a perceived threat, became increasingly tenuous as the battle evolved into a prolonged and resource-intensive engagement. The consequences of this divergence would define the remainder of the campaign on Peleliu. The opening of the Battle of Peleliu revealed a sharp divergence between American operational expectations and the defensive reality constructed by Japanese forces. When U.S. units went ashore on 15 September 1944, the assault phase initially appeared to confirm pre-invasion assumptions. Naval gunfire and airstrikes had suppressed visible coastal positions, beach resistance was limited, and landing schedules were largely maintained. Within hours, however, it became evident that the absence of immediate opposition did not indicate defensive collapse, but a deliberate doctrinal choice by the defender.
Japanese preparations on Peleliu reflected a fundamental shift in defensive doctrine that had emerged across the Pacific by mid-1944. Earlier reliance on beachline defense and decisive counterattack had produced catastrophic losses against superior American firepower. On Peleliu, Japanese command adopted a method designed to absorb assault, survive bombardment, and impose attrition over time. This system was implemented under the authority of Kunio Nakagawa, whose planning emphasized endurance rather than repulsion. The island's terrain was central to this approach. Peleliu was dominated by rugged coral formations, particularly the Umerbrogal ridges, which formed a natural fortress of jagged rock, narrow defiles, and concealed elevations. Japanese engineers expanded these features into a dense network of caves, tunnels, and covered firing positions. These positions were mutually supporting, allowing defenders to engage advancing forces from multiple directions while remaining protected from surface fires. American pre-assault planning recognized the difficulty of the terrain, but underestimated its defensive potential. Bombardment plans assumed that sustained naval gunfire and aerial attack would neutralize fixed positions and disorganize defenders. This assumption was informed by prior operations, where Japanese defenses were less deeply integrated and more vulnerable to surface destruction. At Peleliu, bombardment inflicted damage on exposed targets, but failed to collapse the subterranean defensive system that formed the core of Japanese resistance. As U.S. infantry advanced inland, resistance emerged in a fragmented but coordinated pattern. Japanese positions remained silent during preparatory fires, revealing themselves only when American units entered engagement range. Fire was delivered at close distance from concealed positions, often from elevated or flanking angles that disrupted unit cohesion. Once contact was made, defenders withdrew into protected spaces, denying American forces clear targets for immediate retaliation. This pattern disrupted American operational tempo. Standard methods of advance, artillery preparation followed by infantry movement, proved less effective against defenders who controlled the timing and geometry of engagement. The lack of a defined front line further complicated command and control. Units encountered resistance that appeared discontinuous, leading to confusion regarding enemy disposition and strength. Early success in securing the island's airfield reinforced a perception of progress. The airfield had been identified as the primary operational objective, and its capture was interpreted as validation of the operation's necessity. However, this success masked a deeper problem. Japanese resistance did not hinge on holding the airfield. Control of the island's interior high ground
rather than the runway itself, determined operational reality. With Japanese forces entrenched in the ridges, the airfield's capture provided limited leverage. Casualties increased as American units attempted to reduce fortified positions through direct assault. The terrain restricted maneuver, channeling movement into predictable approaches covered by defensive fires. Armor support was limited by narrow passages and uneven ground, reducing its effectiveness. Coordination between infantry, engineers, artillery, and close air support became increasingly complex as engagements occurred at close range and within overlapping friendly positions. Environmental factors compounded these difficulties. Extreme heat, limited shade, and inadequate water supply imposed physical strain on assault units. The pace of operations slowed, not only due to resistance, but also because of exhaustion and logistical challenges. These factors increased vulnerability and reduced the capacity for sustained offensive momentum.
At the operational level, commanders began to recognize that the battle was diverging sharply from initial projections. What had been planned as a short, decisive operation began to resemble a prolonged clearance effort. Each defensive position required individual attention, consuming time and resources disproportionate to the island's strategic value. Despite this recognition, the operational framework remained largely unchanged during this phase, reflecting the difficulty of adapting doctrine and plans once an operation was fully committed. Japanese defensive behavior achieved its intended effect. By avoiding massed counterattacks and decisive engagements, defenders denied American forces opportunities for rapid resolution. The battle became a series of localized engagements rather than a coherent operational maneuver. Attrition replaced movement as the dominant dynamic, shifting the cost-benefit balance steadily against the attacker. From an analytical perspective, this phase demonstrates how doctrinal misalignment can persist despite available indicators. Intelligence had noted Japanese use of cave systems and defense in depth elsewhere, but the operational implications were not fully integrated into planning for Peleliu. American doctrine prioritized overwhelming firepower and speed. The Japanese system was designed specifically to negate those advantages. By the end of this phase, the nature of the Battle of Peleliu had been defined. The island was not being seized through maneuver, but reduced through attrition. Tactical successes, securing landing zones and key infrastructure, did not translate into operational advantage. The strategic rationale for the operation began to erode as costs mounted and progress slowed. Part 2, therefore, marks the point at which operational cost became visible and unavoidable. The battle had shifted from execution of a plan to management of consequences. Strategic necessity, as originally defined, no longer aligned with the unfolding reality on the ground. The remainder of the campaign would be shaped by efforts to overcome a defensive system that had been underestimated from the outset. As the Battle of Peleliu progressed beyond its opening phase, the operational character of the engagement became fully defined. What had initially appeared as unexpectedly stubborn resistance resolved into a sustained contest of attrition, driven by terrain, defensive design, and institutional constraint. This phase was marked by the systematic reduction of Japanese positions, escalating casualties, and growing tension between operational persistence and strategic justification. The focal point of combat shifted decisively to the island's central high ground. The coral ridges dominating Peleliu's interior formed a complex, interlocking defensive zone that negated many advantages of American firepower and mobility. These ridges were not a single objective, but a series of mutually supporting positions that required sequential clearance. Each advance exposed attacking units to flanking fire from positions that had not yet been identified or neutralized. Japanese defensive conduct during this phase adhered consistently to the principles established before the landing. Defenders avoided decisive engagement and refrained from large-scale counterattacks. Instead, they relied on concealment, fire discipline, and controlled withdrawal within the cave network. Positions were abandoned only when rendered untenable, and even then, withdrawal often led to renewed resistance from adjacent or rearward positions. This approach
maximized the defenders' ability to impose cost while preserving limited manpower. For American forces, the implications were immediate and severe. The absence of a continuous front line undermined traditional methods of command and control.
Units advanced into terrain where enemy presence was inferred rather than observed, forcing reliance on close combat and individual initiative. Progress was measured in yards rather than objectives, and gains often required repeated assaults against positions that re-emerged as threats after initial suppression. Operational tempo slowed accordingly. Attacks required detailed coordination between infantry, engineers, artillery, and armor. Yet terrain constraints limited the effectiveness of each element. Artillery could suppress suspected positions, but rarely achieved decisive destruction. Armor was restricted to narrow approaches and vulnerable to close-range attack. Engineers were indispensable for clearing caves and fortifications, but their work was slow and exposed. Each tactical success incurred casualties that accumulated steadily over time. Environmental conditions compounded these challenges. Extreme heat degraded physical endurance, while limited water supplies strained logistics and morale. The confined battle space concentrated units under constant threat of fire, increasing psychological fatigue. These factors did not determine outcomes independently, but they amplified the cost of each engagement and reduced the margin for error. At the command level, the battle presented a dilemma that doctrine did not readily resolve. The mission remained unchanged: eliminate Japanese resistance and secure the island. Yet the cost required to achieve this objective far exceeded initial projections. Casualty reports reflected a rate disproportionate to the island's size and apparent strategic value. Despite this, there was little institutional mechanism to reassess the necessity of continued operations once committed. This persistence reflected broader characteristics of U.S. operational culture in the Pacific. Amphibious operations were planned as decisive acts whose success validated their execution. Once an objective was designated and forces committed, withdrawal or termination was viewed as unacceptable unless defeat was imminent. At Peleliu, the battle was costly, but not failing in the narrow tactical sense. Japanese resistance was being reduced, albeit slowly. Within this framework, continuation appeared obligatory. Japanese defenders exploited this dynamic effectively. Their strategy did not depend on holding specific terrain indefinitely, but on prolonging resistance and increasing cost. Each day that American forces remained engaged validated the defensive approach. Even as Japanese casualties mounted and logistical conditions deteriorated, the defensive system continued to function as designed, imposing friction and delay without requiring operational maneuver. The cumulative effect of these conditions transformed Peleliu into an attritional engagement whose strategic relevance became increasingly ambiguous. The airfield, initially cited as the primary objective, played no decisive role in subsequent operations. Japanese air activity in the region had already declined, and control of the runway did not alter Allied operational freedom. Yet the battle continued because the defensive system remained intact, and the mission had not been formally reconsidered. This phase illustrates a critical analytical distinction between operational necessity and operational inertia. Peleliu was no longer essential to protecting forthcoming operations, but the cost already incurred created its own justification for continuation. Terminating the operation would have required acknowledging that earlier assumptions were flawed, a conclusion institutionally difficult to accept amid ongoing combat. At the tactical level, adaptation occurred incrementally. American units refined methods for reducing fortified positions, improving coordination, and developing specialized techniques for cave clearance. These adaptations improved effectiveness, but did not change the fundamental dynamic. Each success required disproportionate effort relative to strategic return, and progress remained slow. From a systemic perspective, The battle exposed the limits of firepower-centric doctrine when applied against a defender optimized for endurance rather than repulsion. Overwhelming fire could suppress and isolate positions, but it could not compel rapid collapse. The defender's willingness to trade space for time neutralized the attacker's emphasis on speed and momentum. By the end of this phase, the outcome of the battle was no longer in doubt, but its meaning was. Japanese resistance was being steadily reduced, yet at a cost that raised implicit questions about proportionality. These questions were rarely articulated formally during the battle, but they informed post-war analysis and retrospective evaluation. Part 3 thus represents the point at which the Battle of Peleliu became defined by its cost rather than its objectives. The engagement continued not because its strategic necessity increased, but because institutional commitment and operational momentum carried it forward. The implications of this dynamic extend beyond Peleliu itself, offering insight into how military organizations persist in costly operations once initiated, even as original justifications erode. Understanding this phase is essential to evaluating the battle as a whole. Peleliu did not become costly through accident or incompetence, but through interaction between doctrine, terrain, and decision-making under constraint. The remainder of the campaign would unfold within this framework, as American forces sought to complete an operation whose strategic value had become increasingly marginal relative to its human and material cost. As the Battle of Peleliu continued into late September and October 1944, the engagement entered a phase defined by diminishing strategic clarity and sustained operational commitment. Japanese resistance persisted, despite severe attrition, and American forces remained engaged in a battle whose original rationale no longer aligned clearly with conditions elsewhere in the Pacific. This phase highlights how institutional momentum and the logic of completion can sustain costly operations even after their strategic utility has declined. By this stage, Japanese defensive capacity on Peleliu had been significantly degraded, but not neutralized. The remaining defenders continued to operate within the island's cave systems, conducting localized resistance that denied American forces a clear endpoint. Although Japanese command and logistics were collapsing, the defensive network retained sufficient cohesion to impose continued casualties. The battle thus evolved into a prolonged clearance operation rather than a contest for operational control. American command faced a narrowing set of choices. Withdrawal was not considered viable, as it would concede the field after substantial investment and casualties. Accelerated assault risked additional losses without guaranteeing rapid resolution. The chosen course was continuation through systematic reduction, reflecting an institutional preference for completion once objectives were formally assigned. This preference was reinforced by the absence of a mechanism to reassess the operation's necessity in light of changing strategic circumstances. The broader strategic environment further weakened the original justification for Peleliu. U.S. forces were advancing rapidly elsewhere in the Pacific, and operational plans for the Philippines progressed independently of events on the island. Japanese air power in the region had been effectively neutralized, reducing the relevance of Peleliu's airfield as a threat or asset. Despite this, the battle continued, largely insulated from external reassessment. At the tactical level, American units refined their methods for dealing with entrenched defenders. Combined arms coordination improved incrementally, and specialized techniques for cave reduction were employed more effectively. These adaptations increased tactical efficiency, but did not alter the fundamental cost structure of the engagement. Each remaining Japanese position required deliberate effort to eliminate, and progress remained slow relative to the resources expended. The persistence of resistance also reflected Japanese strategic intent. Peleliu was not expected to influence the outcome of the war, but it served as a demonstration of the new defensive doctrine's effectiveness. By prolonging the battle and imposing casualties, Japanese forces achieved their limited objective of maximizing cost. The absence of large-scale counterattacks or attempts to retake lost ground underscored the defensive nature of this strategy. For American forces, the psychological dimension of prolonged combat became increasingly significant.
Units operated under constant threat from concealed positions, with no clear front line or decisive engagement. This environment eroded morale and intensified fatigue, reinforcing the perception of the battle as an obligation rather than an opportunity. Leadership focused on sustaining cohesion and completing assigned tasks rather than pursuing operational innovation. Institutionally, this phase exposed the difficulty of disengaging from operations once they have begun. The sunk cost of earlier decisions created an implicit pressure to justify continuation through completion. Success became defined narrowly as elimination of remaining resistance, regardless of whether that outcome contributed meaningfully to broader strategic goals. This dynamic illustrates how military organizations can conflate tactical closure with strategic necessity. The battle's persistence also affected resource allocation. Forces and materiel committed to Peleliu were unavailable for other operations, although the overall impact was mitigated by American industrial capacity. Nevertheless, the opportunity cost of prolonged engagement on a marginal objective became increasingly apparent in hindsight. At the time, however, these costs were diffused across a rapidly expanding theater, reducing their immediate visibility. By the end of this phase, the Battle of Peleliu had become emblematic of a particular kind of operational problem, an engagement that is tactically manageable but strategically inefficient. The remaining Japanese resistance posed no credible threat to Allied operations elsewhere, yet its elimination demanded continued sacrifice. The battle's continuation was driven less by necessity than by adherence to the original decision framework. Part 4, therefore, marks the consolidation of Peleliu's defining characteristic. The operation no longer served its initial strategic purpose, but it continued because the institutional system lacked a clear mechanism to terminate it without achieving total success. This phase underscores how operational cost can become decoupled from strategic value, and how completion can substitute for necessity in sustained combat. The implications of this dynamic extend beyond Peleliu. They illustrate a recurring challenge in large-scale warfare, distinguishing between objectives that remain essential and those that persist primarily because they were once deemed important. The Battle of Peleliu in this phase became less about defeating the enemy than about fulfilling an obligation created by earlier assumptions. By November 1944, the Battle of Peleliu had effectively concluded in operational terms, but its analytical significance was only beginning to emerge.
Japanese resistance was reduced to isolated pockets incapable of influencing Allied operations, and American forces completed clearance of the island at a cost that far exceeded initial projections. This phase focuses on the post-battle reassessment, how Peleliu was interpreted within Allied command, how its outcomes compared to its original justification, and what the engagement revealed about decision-making in the Pacific War. The immediate military outcome was unambiguous. The island was secured, Japanese forces were destroyed or rendered combat ineffective, and the airfield was placed under American control. From a narrow operational perspective, the mission had been accomplished. However, when evaluated against its stated strategic purpose, protecting forthcoming operations toward the Philippines, the value of this success was increasingly difficult to substantiate. Subsequent events in the Pacific undercut the original rationale for the assault. Allied landings in the Philippines proceeded without meaningful interference from Japanese air power based in the Palau Islands. Japanese aviation assets in the region proved incapable of sustained offensive action, a reality that had already been apparent before the Peleliu landing. The airfield that had justified the operation did not play a decisive role in supporting Allied advances, nor did its absence materially affect Japanese capabilities. This disconnect prompted retrospective scrutiny within Allied planning circles. While no formal repudiation of the decision occurred during the war, post-war analyses increasingly characterized Peleliu as an operation whose cost was disproportionate to its strategic return. The battle was contrasted with other instances in which bypassing or isolating Japanese positions achieved comparable strategic effects at far lower cost.
Institutionally, Peleliu exposed the limits of doctrinal rigidity. U.S.
Operational planning in the Central Pacific emphasized systematic reduction of enemy positions along projected lines of advance. This approach reduced uncertainty and ensured continuity, but it also discouraged selective disengagement when conditions changed. At Peleliu, the persistence of an operation conceived under outdated assumptions demonstrated how planning systems could prioritize consistency over adaptability. The battle also highlighted the influence of command structure on strategic choice. Decisions regarding Peleliu were shaped within a divided Pacific Command environment, where competing operational visions coexisted. The operation aligned with the logic of incremental advance and airfield seizure, even as alternative approaches, emphasizing bypass and isolation, were gaining credibility elsewhere. Peleliu became a case where institutional compromise produced action without clear strategic necessity. For American forces involved in the battle, the cost was tangible and immediate. Casualties sustained on Peleliu were among the highest of any Pacific engagement relative to duration and scale. These losses did not translate into commensurate strategic advantage, intensifying the sense that the battle represented an avoidable expenditure of combat power. This perception would later influence how Peleliu was remembered within the U.S. military. From an analytical standpoint, the critical issue is not whether Peleliu was fought competently, but whether it needed to be fought at all. Tactical execution improved over time, and units adapted effectively to Japanese defensive methods. The problem lay upstream, in the persistence of a decision whose underlying assumptions had eroded. Once committed, the operation followed a logic of completion rather than continuous validation. Japanese defensive conduct further clarifies the battle's meaning. The defenders achieved their limited objective of imposing cost, but they did not alter the strategic trajectory of the war. Their resistance demonstrated the effectiveness of defense in depth against firepower-centric doctrine, but it did so in service of delay rather than victory. In this sense, both sides achieved their immediate aims, while neither gained decisive strategic advantage from the engagement. Peleliu's legacy thus lies in what it revealed about proportionality. The battle underscored the importance of aligning operational effort with strategic value, particularly when resources and time are abundant, but not infinite. It demonstrated that success defined solely by objective completion can obscure deeper questions about necessity and efficiency. By the end of this phase, Peleliu had assumed its place not as a turning point, but as a cautionary example. The island did not shape the outcome of the Pacific War, but it shaped understanding of how wars are managed at scale. The engagement illustrated how institutional momentum, doctrinal habit, and incomplete reassessment can combine to sustain costly operations beyond their point of strategic relevance. Part 5 therefore reframes the Battle of Peleliu as an analytical lesson rather than a purely historical event. Its significance lies not in what was gained, but in what was spent, and why that expenditure was accepted. The answers to those questions extend beyond Peleliu itself, offering insight into the broader challenges of strategic decision-making in large, complex wars. The Battle of Peleliu occupies a distinct analytical position within the broader conduct of the Pacific War because it exposes how institutional decision-making responds, or fails to respond, to changing strategic conditions. This phase examines Peleliu not as an isolated error or anomaly, but as a product of systemic incentives, command structures, and doctrinal habits that shaped American operations in 1944. Understanding these factors is essential to evaluating why the operation proceeded as it did, and why its costs were accepted, despite diminishing strategic returns. At the institutional level, Peleliu illustrates the momentum inherent in large-scale operational planning. By mid-1944, American war planning in the Pacific operated on extended timelines with tightly sequenced objectives. Amphibious operations required months of preparation, involving naval assets, logistics, air support, and ground forces. Once an operation entered this pipeline, altering or cancelling it
imposed friction across multiple commands, and risked disrupting the broader campaign schedule. In this environment, continuity often outweighed reassessment. This structural inertia shaped how new information was processed. Intelligence indicating reduced Japanese air capability in the Palau region did not immediately invalidate Peleliu's rationale, because the operation's justification had already been formalized and disseminated. Rather than triggering reconsideration, updated intelligence was absorbed selectively, treated as a variable within an existing plan, rather than as a reason to challenge the plan itself. This pattern reflects a common institutional tendency. Decisions made under uncertainty tend to persist even as uncertainty diminishes. Command relationships in the Pacific further reinforced this dynamic. The theater was divided among multiple operational authorities with overlapping responsibilities and differing strategic priorities. Within this framework, Peleliu aligned with one dominant planning logic: the systematic seizure of positions along projected lines of advance, even as alternative approaches, emphasizing bypass and isolation, gained prominence elsewhere. The absence of a single, unified mechanism for adjudicating between these approaches allowed the operation to proceed without decisive challenge. Doctrinal influence was equally significant.
American amphibious doctrine emphasized the elimination of potential threats to advancing forces. This emphasis was shaped by earlier experiences in which bypassed positions later interfered with operations. By 1944, however, the balance of power had shifted. American naval and air superiority reduced the ability of isolated Japanese garrisons to exert meaningful influence. Peleliu represented a case where doctrine lagged behind strategic reality, continuing to prioritize elimination of threats that had become largely theoretical. The acceptance of cost at Peleliu must also be understood within the context of American resource abundance. By late 1944, the United States possessed overwhelming industrial and manpower capacity relative to Japan. This abundance reduced immediate pressure to economize force at the operational level. Losses incurred at Peleliu, while severe, did not threaten the overall conduct of the war. As a result, the incentive to terminate a costly operation on efficiency grounds was weaker than it might have been under conditions of scarcity. This does not imply indifference to casualties, but rather a strategic environment in which losses could be absorbed without forcing immediate reconsideration of objectives. The availability of replacement units, materiel, and logistical support allowed operations to continue even when cost-benefit ratios deteriorated. Peleliu thus highlights how abundance can obscure inefficiency, enabling operations to persist despite questionable necessity. The Japanese defensive strategy interacted with these institutional characteristics in a way that magnified cost. By adopting a doctrine designed to prolong engagement rather than defeat the attacker outright, Japanese forces exploited the American commitment to completion. Each additional day of resistance imposed casualties without offering the defender a decisive target. The American system, oriented toward total elimination of resistance once engaged, had difficulty disengaging from such a contest. From an operational analysis perspective, the critical failure at Peleliu was not tactical adaptation. American units learned to counter cave defenses and improve combined arms coordination. The failure lay at the level of operational choice, the inability to reassess whether continued effort remained justified. This distinction is important. Peleliu was not a case of battlefield incompetence, but of strategic inflexibility once action was underway. Comparisons with other Pacific operations reinforced this conclusion. In several instances later in the war, Japanese-held islands were bypassed or isolated, rendering their garrisons strategically irrelevant without costly assault. These decisions reflected an evolving understanding of how to apply American advantages most efficiently. Peleliu, by contrast, remained anchored to an earlier planning model, even as that model was being revised elsewhere. The timing of Peleliu is therefore significant. The operation occurred during a transitional period in American Pacific strategy,
when older assumptions about airfield necessity and threat elimination coexisted with emerging confidence in naval and air dominance. Peleliu became a casualty of this transition, executed according to logic that was already being superseded. Post-war assessments increasingly reflected this understanding. While wartime narratives emphasized valor and perseverance, analytical evaluations highlighted the disproportionate cost relative to strategic gain. Peleliu was frequently cited in professional military education as an example of how operations can succeed tactically while failing to deliver commensurate strategic value. Its lessons were not about courage or sacrifice, but about alignment between objectives and effort. In this sense, Peleliu contributed indirectly to doctrinal evolution.
The recognition that not every enemy position required seizure influenced post-war thinking about operational economy and selective engagement. The battle underscored the importance of continuously validating assumptions, particularly in dynamic strategic environments where conditions change faster than planning cycles. Part 6 therefore situates the Battle of Peleliu within a broader analytical framework. It was not simply an unfortunate decision or a tragic necessity, but a manifestation of how large military institutions operate under conditions of momentum, abundance, and doctrinal habit. The costs incurred were real, but so were the lessons derived. Understanding Peleliu at this level allows for a more nuanced assessment. The battle does not indict American capability or resolve. Instead, it illuminates the challenges of strategic choice in a war of unprecedented scale. Peleliu demonstrates that even dominant powers can expend resources inefficiently when institutional processes lag behind strategic reality. This phase sets the stage for final evaluation. The Battle of Peleliu must ultimately be judged not by whether it was won, but by what it reveals about how wars are managed when success is assumed and reassessment becomes difficult. The final part will synthesize these insights, framing Peleliu as a case study in strategic necessity, constrained and ultimately undermined by operational and institutional inertia. The broader implications of the Battle of Peleliu become clearer when the operation is situated alongside concurrent and subsequent American actions in the Pacific. This phase evaluates how Peleliu interacted with the larger strategic sequence of 1944-1945, and what its outcomes reveal about opportunity cost, alternative courses of action, and the practical limits of doctrinal consistency. At the time Peleliu was being fought to conclusion, American forces were already executing operations of far greater strategic consequence. The invasion of the Philippines, beginning with Battle of Leyte, unfolded on a scale that decisively altered the balance of power in the Pacific. Japanese naval forces were shattered, lines of communication to Southeast Asia were severed, and American air and naval dominance became effectively uncontested. These developments occurred independently of the outcome on Peleliu. The contrast is analytically significant. While Peleliu absorbed disproportionate combat power for a marginal objective, Leyte delivered decisive strategic results by directly attacking the core of Japan's defensive perimeter. Japanese airfields and garrisons bypassed elsewhere were rendered irrelevant, not by destruction, but by isolation and loss of operational context. This divergence highlights that strategic effect derived increasingly from system-level disruption rather than from elimination of every potential threat node. From this perspective, Peleliu represents a misalignment between effort and effect. The island's capture neither accelerated the Philippine campaign nor measurably reduced Japanese capacity to interfere with Allied operations. The airfield, once cited as a critical threat, did not factor meaningfully into Japanese operations before or after its loss. The campaign's outcome elsewhere demonstrated that American control of sea and airspace was sufficient to neutralize such threats without direct assault. This raises the question of alternatives, not in a counterfactual sense, but as an analytical comparison. By late 1944, American forces increasingly employed a strategy of bypass and containment. Japanese garrisons left isolated on islands such as Truk or Rabaul remained militarily intact but strategically inert. Peleliu could have been treated similarly, particularly given the declining relevance of land-based Japanese air power and the absence of a Japanese fleet capable of exploiting such bases.
The persistence of the Peleliu operation thus underscores the role of sequencing and timing in strategic decision-making. The decision to assault was made under assumptions that had been overtaken by events, but the execution proceeded because it was already embedded within an operational sequence. Once committed, the logic of completion replaced the logic of necessity. In contrast, later operations benefited from a clearer appreciation of systemic dominance and the diminishing returns of total elimination. For the Japanese side, the battle's outcome reinforced a defensive logic already in place. The resistance at Peleliu demonstrated that defense in depth could impose significant cost, even when ultimate defeat was certain. However, this success was tactical and psychological rather than strategic. It did not delay Allied operations in the Philippines in any meaningful way, nor did it alter the trajectory of the war. The Japanese garrison achieved endurance, but not influence. Within the US military, Peleliu's implications were absorbed unevenly. Wartime reporting emphasized bravery and perseverance, framing the battle as a necessary step within a broader advance. Post-war analysis, less constrained by immediate morale considerations, increasingly questioned the proportionality of the effort. Professional military education began to use Peleliu as an example of how success at the tactical level can coexist with inefficiency at the strategic level. This distinction is central. Peleliu was not a failure of execution. Units adapted, coordination improved, and objectives were achieved. The issue lay in the selection and persistence of the objective itself. When evaluated alongside operations that delivered decisive strategic effects with comparable or lower cost, Peleliu appears increasingly anomalous. The battle also illustrates how dominant powers can afford inefficiency without immediate penalty. American industrial capacity and manpower absorbed Peleliu's losses without compromising subsequent operations. This capacity masked the strategic inefficiency of the operation at the time, allowing it to be framed as acceptable. Only in comparative hindsight does the imbalance between cost and effect become stark. Part 7 therefore situates Peleliu within the wider operational pattern of the Pacific War's final year. It reveals an inflection point at which American strategy increasingly emphasized isolation over annihilation, system disruption over positional control. Peleliu stands slightly apart from this evolution, not because it contradicted American capability, but because it reflected an earlier planning logic executed too late. The analytical value of this phase lies in contrast. By comparing Peleliu with contemporaneous operations that achieved decisive results, the battle's limitations become clear without recourse to moral judgment or hindsight bias. The island was taken, the enemy was destroyed, but the war moved forward, largely unaffected. In this sense, Peleliu's significance is relational rather than intrinsic. Its meaning emerges only when placed against what was achieved elsewhere at the same time. That comparison reinforces the central theme of the battle. Strategic necessity must be continually reassessed, or it risks becoming a static justification for dynamic cost. The Battle of Peleliu concludes as an analytical case not of operational failure, but of strategic misalignment, sustained by institutional momentum. Its final significance lies in what it reveals about how military organizations translate intent into action, and how that translation can persist even after the conditions that justified it have changed. At every stage, Peleliu functioned as a technically successful operation. The landing was executed competently, Japanese resistance was methodically reduced, and the island was secured. No single phase collapsed due to tactical error or command breakdown. Yet when assessed against the strategic environment of late 1944, the operation's contribution to Allied success appears marginal. The airfield, whose seizure justified the assault, did not shape subsequent campaigns. Japanese forces elsewhere were neutralized through isolation rather than destruction. The war's decisive movements occurred independently of Peleliu's outcome. This disparity underscores a central analytical principle. Operational success does not guarantee strategic value. At Peleliu, the means were applied effectively, but toward an end whose relevance had diminished. The persistence of the operation reflected confidence in execution rather than continuous validation of purpose. Once the objective was defined and forces committed, institutional processes favored completion over reconsideration. The battle also illustrates how doctrine can become prescriptive rather than adaptive. American Pacific strategy had evolved from early caution toward increasing reliance on naval and air dominance. However, doctrinal emphasis on eliminating potential threats remained influential, even as those threats lost practical relevance. Peleliu exposed the lag between strategic reality and doctrinal habit, a gap that translated directly into operational cost. From an institutional perspective, the battle demonstrates how abundance shapes decision-making. The United States could absorb casualties and materiel losses without jeopardizing the broader war effort. This capacity reduced the urgency of efficiency at the operational level. Inefficient operations did not impose immediate strategic penalties, allowing them to proceed unchecked. Peleliu shows how dominance can mask misallocation, making cost visible only in retrospect. The Japanese defensive response further sharpens the analysis. The defenders achieved their limited objective, to impose maximum cost without expectation of victory.
Their success depended not on defeating the attacker, but on exploiting the attacker's commitment to total elimination. This interaction produced a battle whose duration and intensity were driven less by strategic contest than by mutual adherence to incompatible logics, attrition versus completion. In post-war evaluation, Peleliu emerged as a reference point for professional reflection rather than celebration. It entered military education not as a model of maneuver or decisive action, but as an example of proportionality failure. The lesson was not that Peleliu should never have been fought in absolute terms, but that its necessity should have been reassessed as conditions evolved. The inability to disengage from that reassessment defines the battle's enduring relevance. The case also cautions against linear interpretations of progress. The Pacific War advanced rapidly in 1944 to 1945, but not every action along that path contributed equally to its outcome. Peleliu reminds analysts that momentum can conceal inefficiency and that success elsewhere does not retroactively justify cost incurred on marginal objectives. In final assessment, the Battle of Peleliu stands as a study in strategic inertia. It demonstrates how early assumptions, once institutionalized, can survive long after their analytical foundation erodes. The operation was executed with discipline and determination, yet it delivered limited strategic return relative to its cost. This imbalance was not accidental, but systemic. For an educated US audience, Peleliu's value lies in its clarity. It shows that even in a winning war, choices matter. Resources, time, and lives can be expended in ways that do not meaningfully advance strategic aims if reassessment is deferred in favor of completion. The battle's lessons are therefore enduring, applicable beyond its historical context. Peleliu did not alter the outcome of the Second World War. What it altered was understanding, revealing how doctrine, planning cycles, and institutional confidence interact under conditions of dominance. In that sense, the battle's importance is analytical rather than operational. It remains a reminder that strategic necessity must be continuously tested, or it risks becoming an assumption sustained only by momentum.